Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are. This is Doug Brunke on the road, as it turns out. So, we are talking about risk, and so I just want to warn you, I am not driving. I'm sitting in a very safe parking lot, so no worries there. Without my seatbelt, so don't worry there. We have four experts about risk, and one of the things I think that we all can determine is that the world is quite a bit hectic, more hectic, I think, than it's maybe been, at least in my lifetime, in terms of daily types of things that are going on all around the world. And so what we thought we'd do is, given that all of us are running businesses around the world, how do we manage it? What are some of the things that we should be thinking about? And then how do we use that input to make better decisions for our business? And so we're going to start today with Meredith Wilson. She's spoken before at Global Chamber, and so we have her back again. She's the founder and CEO of Emergent Risk International. And one of the great things about Meredith is she's traveling all over the world. She has her pulse on, she's got her finger on the pulse of the world, and she's going to kick us off here with a little bit more of a broad view. So Meredith, thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing more about your view of risk out there.
All right, thank you. I'm going to just switch over to a slide presentation here real quick, see if I can keep myself on task. And are you able to see the slides there, Doug?
I'm not able to see it yet.
Oh wait, hang on. There's a button here that says share. Let's try that. Did that work? All right. Let me just put this into slideshow mode here. All right. Can you see that?
Yes.
You good? All right.
Yep, we're good.
All right, so Doug gave me 8 minutes to tell you about everything that's going wrong in the world. That's not going to happen, but what I decided to focus in on fairly quickly here was just talking about political risk in general. Just briefly, Emergent Risk, our company, is a strategic intel and advisory firm. We work with primarily Fortune 500s, but we are starting to move into middle market companies as well. And we do 4 things. So we do bespoke political cyber business risk advisory work. So that's anything from major geopolitical issues and how they're affecting companies to how a geopolitically motivated cyber attack might affect a company. We have a subscription analysis and technology tool where we help companies, we provide daily and biweekly analysis to companies about everything going on in the world and how that affects business. With that, we also have an online tool that allows companies to build their own analysis. We do consulting services. We help companies build intel services, and then we also do training for corporate intelligence research and analysis professionals. So like I said before, it's kind of hard to narrow this down, but one of the things that is consistent right now is political risk. And so when I'm talking about political risk, I'm talking primarily about companies getting caught up in the middle of either state-to-state political conflict or interstate political conflict. So where we have a lot of civil unrest going on right now, and we have internal battles going on between groups that are sort of ideologically opposed. So this little map that I made last night shows you all of the countries that are experiencing some type of fairly regular and major sort of political, social, or in the case of the green countries, also environmental sort of climate driven protests. So in the last year, we have had 6 governments toppled. So those are the blue countries there, where you have Sudan, Algeria, Bolivia, Peru. Peru, I think, has been through 2 presidents just this year. And then also, they're hard to see on the map, but also Lebanon and Jordan have both seen prime ministers dismissed over these major protests. The yellow countries have seen major sustained protest movements. So everything from Hong Kong to Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, over to Venezuela, Chile, And then of course those blue countries also. So just looking at the scale and size of some of the movements, India is highlighted there too because of the changes in Kashmir. In this most recent issue with the temple ruling, which they've clamped down so hard that you would have protest movements, and you may still because of the way that they're handling them. But we've seen sustained, sometimes violent confrontation in governments with in at least 15 countries this year. And then the growing climate movement, I include that because it's getting larger and larger, and it's becoming a major piece of electoral issues, and it's putting a lot of pressure on companies as well. So that's just a little tiny piece of the political risk that most businesses are looking at as they're looking into working overseas right now. This is some of the immediate business impacts. So here's one. Disney says Hong Kong protests could wipe out $275 million in profit. Blocking the highways, that's a major issue right now, blocking highways, airports, even ports. The Yellow Vest protests, which caused a lot of economic damage in France over the last year. Also, we're looking at global issues, where we're looking at a lot of these countries where we have governments that are, I won't want to say under siege, but that I'm sure that's how they feel. Governments that are under a lot of pressure to revise or change the way that they do business. And a lot of what's going to come with that is higher social spending and higher government debt. And that's going to make a difference for anybody who's working with those countries and looking to sell into those countries. So in general themes that we're seeing around the world: heightened nationalism, authoritarianism, and tightening control over freedom of speech. On the flip side of that, we have protesters angry over inequality, concern over the environment, and then this sort of kind of increasing political polarization as countries are kind of dividing into 2 or 3 camps. What that means for businesses is that businesses are often the common target of these kind of, because they get caught in between the pro-democracy sort of protests and the economic, and the government side of it. So if you look at Hong Kong, for example, and I'll show you that in just a second, what you see is that businesses are getting pressed to take sides. And this is where some of the biggest risk comes in, particularly for companies that are going overseas that have not spent a lot of time working in this on this side of things. The ones that do not have the political and security awareness are the ones that often end up unwittingly stuck in the middle, whether it's because somebody decides to tweet about it and it goes the wrong way. Whether it's because of, for example, Starbucks in Hong Kong has been attacked repeatedly, not really through anything that they've done wrong, but because the company or the local conglomerate that owns all of the Starbucks chains in Hong Kong happens to be owned by a pro-China family. And the daughter of that family went and spoke at the UN General Assembly in defense of the Chinese government. And once that happened, all of this family's stores got vandalized and attacked. And that is not just Starbucks, but a whole bunch of different Chinese chains. And then I think they also have Shake Shack over there. So they unwittingly found themselves in the middle of that. And even though owned by a Chinese company over there, they're franchised and it's a brand issue. Similarly, and on the flip side of that, was of course the NBA. And in the case of the NBA, we had the manager for the Houston Rockets who tweeted something in Hong Kong's defense and probably wasn't even thinking about it. It was a Friday night, just was, kind of watching what was happening. And it turned into a major firestorm for them. So that initial defense of Hong Kong led to a whole bunch of Chinese government retaliation where they took the NBA offline, as well as more unofficial retaliation from sort of Chinese netizens, boycott campaigns, that kind of thing. So what we're seeing in general is this squeezing of companies in between the protesters and the government. And the reason for that is because these companies are the economic engine of growth. And if they can't target the government directly, and particularly in places where you have a more authoritarian government, you will see more and more of this targeting of companies. So that does not mean that we shouldn't do business in these countries, but it does mean that the level of awareness that we have to have right now around politics and around cultures and around politically sensitive issues is much, much higher than it used to be. So within this whole structure, we also have behind the China stuff the trade issues, and so that's playing into this same set of issues, and has left a lot of companies sort of informally targeted by regulation, all kinds of other issues. So I was going to talk a little bit about the trade war. I don't want to go over time though. Do we want to stop there, Caesar, so that we stay on time?
You can go a couple more minutes, Meredith.
Okay, all right. So speaking of trade wars and speaking of political risk, this is another major political risk for companies. As much as I think we all hoped that the China issue would be settled by now, I think we can all see that it's going to be a very long-term issue. The election year itself, I think anything post-January 2020 is very unlikely that we're going to see a settlement of the China trade issue, because at that point it is mostly governments sitting back and watching to see what happens with the elections. Nobody wants to sign a trade deal with a government that may or may not be there post-January 2021. So there's a good chance that there will be some minor incremental moving forward, because both the Chinese president and the US president need a good win on this. But there is very, very little chance of resolving the Huawei issue, of resolving the overarching sort of IP issues and that type of thing. These are just points we can kind of skip over. I think the other trade issues that are going on right now, I think there's a reasonably good chance that the USMCA will get passed. If it doesn't, that's going to create more problems and more stress. But I think because both sides of the US government want to get it done, there's a good chance that this will actually get done before 2020. But the EU and India, these other trade deals are almost certain to languish post January because of the election year. So that puts us in a continuously somewhat precarious situation. I'm going to skip over that because we've just kind of talked about this. The last thing I will say is the elections themselves will present pretty significant political risk for all U.S. business. And that goes back to the trade war slide that I just skipped. But when we look at the impacts of the trade war so far, and we look at kind of what's happened with farms in the middle part of the country, when we look at what's happened with the auto industry, all of those things are going to resurface this year, and there may be very swift changes because of the elections. We're also looking at things like very touchy issues like gun safety, healthcare, identity politics, extremism. All of those issues are going to pop up, and at least in the case of large companies, companies are getting forced into choosing a side sometimes. And you can see this a lot with the companies on the West Coast, with the tech companies, where you can see people kind of pushing back on them because they feel like they're too political one way or the other. And a lot of that manifests itself in online reputation related stuff. But even small companies can get caught up in this. And this is, again, another thing to keep in mind if you are going to be working in the US, is to be very careful of those cultural politics and those types of things that could unintentionally land you on one side of the political spectrum or another. It's going to be a very difficult year, also from the perspective of information and news and what's out there and what's being said and what's real and what's not. So this is another one that a few years ago I wouldn't have even imagined we would have spent so much time with our clients on, but this is one where we're spending a lot of time right now. So I don't want to go any further on that. This is my contact info, and we will, if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to take them whenever Doug and Caesar would like me to do that.
Fantastic. Just a quick question, Meredith, and we'll take
Yeah.
more questions as we go along. We'll have time at the end. There's a lot of things going on. What's the conversation that happens when you're talking about, there's risk, but you still need to do business there?
Yeah.
What are some of the things, how do you approach these kinds of things? Is there a process? What do you normally recommend?
Well, I wouldn't say there's necessarily a set process. For the smaller businesses and the medium-sized businesses, a lot of it is about understanding what they already know and what their specific business is. And then from there, we've got to look at everything from the sort of political situation on the ground, but also, who are the players, who are the influencers involved. Companies, particularly small companies, can sometimes get themselves unintentionally aligned with a political actor in the countries where they're working. And that can lead to really good business opportunities and really big problems when things go bad for that particular political actor. So it really is very, very situation dependent. There are companies that have been working in Hong Kong, amidst all of this chaos and have had virtually no problems. There are other companies that it's just problem after problem because of their either, public facing sort of issues, or because something, somebody put online that really wasn't even necessarily true. So there's so many different angles that you have to look at. And a lot of it is just sitting down with the client and understanding what their major points of vulnerability are, and where they're leveraged, and kind of drawing out a sort of a process from there in terms of information discovery and analysis and that type of thing. Does that make sense?
Okay, it does. So those of you who have questions, go to the chat room or send an email to info@globalchamber.org. Meredith, hold on. We're now going to go to Denver and Trevor Jones. He's the CEO of Lynx Global Intelligence. And one of the things we know about Trevor is that he's smart. He's got some really extraordinary tools that he has and that he uses for his clients. And so, Trevor, thank you. And you're an Arizona State University graduate as well, so I should probably mention that. The most innovative university in the United States for 5 straight years.
Yeah, so first, Doug, I got to ask, where are you? Are you about to play golf? It looks really nice.
Okay. Definitely Arizona, Camelback Mountain.
Oh, it looks great. So thank you very much, Meredith. I thought that was actually a fantastic panorama of kind of the risk landscape right now. I think a lot of us are worried about similar types of things right now, just because the risk profile for businesses has augmented along those social lines, right? So you're seeing those protests, you're seeing reputational damage that's going ahead and hurting the bottom line or the stock price. And in the case of some of our clients, you're seeing disruptions to their operations that are pretty significant. So what I'll do just briefly here is talk a little bit about Lynx, and then I'll talk about maybe some more of the kind of granular aspects around several of the strains that Meredith mentioned, because that was such a good kind of vista of what's going on. And then I'll talk about just a little bit about how we help our clients and do a quick screen share as well. So Lynx Global Intelligence was founded about 4 years ago. We started out strictly in the political risk space. Since then, in the last year and a half or so, we've moved to a strong technology stance where we're actually stacking consulting services on top of the technology that we're producing. And I know this is true of many of the firms. I know both International SOS and also Emergent Risk have some technology initiatives they're working on too. So this is something you're starting to see, is the kind of application of big data and other types of techniques to the risk landscape. And so Lynx now produces a big data mapping platform, and doing that along with our consulting around risk, security services for the mining, the finance, and also the enterprise security and kind of threat analysis sector writ large. And so what that really means is, we're monitoring two things oftentimes. The first thing is kinetic, right? The who, where and what. Where are trucks, where are alarm systems going off? We're ingesting things like Internet of Things databases to understand, that risk aperture, what's going on. So that's pretty cool, and I'll get to some of that in a minute, but we're also helping along some of the more, I would say, tangential risk areas. And one area that we've seen come on board pretty recently has been the ESG movement. So this is environment, social, and governance data that we can ingest to help particularly finance companies with that piece of their risk portfolio. And that has to do with mitigating reputational risk and also enhancing your business continuity along those three lines. So just to piggyback really quick on a couple things Meredith said, I think that, one of the biggest concerns right now in the business community is that some of these social aspects, reputational aspects, and then also the political protests that are happening everywhere from Chile to Lebanon to Hong Kong, as you can see very visibly in the news. It's all over the world, and so sometimes these sentiments and these grievances can cause pretty damaging effects to your business continuity. So, and then on the climate piece as well, and I'm really happy to hear that other risk-oriented firms are working on climate too. I mean, there's the kind of near-term direct climate consequence of your operations being flooded, or the soil kind of desalinating somewhere, or your supply chains being disrupted because of climate factors. But there's some other downstream effects, in the 5-10 year event horizon that we're tracking as well. And those have to do with migration, and then how the policies that migration engenders are going ahead and affect business. So what does that mean, right? That means as climate conditions become more difficult for populations in Latin America and Africa, Southeast Asia, we're going to see a lot more migration to the global north, right? To the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. As that happens, we tend to see this right-wing backlash we've seen in Europe, we've seen in the United States. What happens there, and I'm talking about a far extreme right-wing backlash here. What happens there is migration policy becomes restricted, but also, as Meredith mentioned, trade policies start to become more restricted and isolationist too. If that causes a global slowdown, you're seeing a real effect directly from both climate and the ensuing migration on what happens. So that's a lot of buzzwords. I'm going to go ahead and show our platform really quick. I'll share my screen. This is the Lynx Global Intelligence Mapping Platform, and what we're trying to do, the platform is distill data, aggregate data in a way that our clients can go ahead and make risk decisions more efficiently. And then, of course, we consult on top of this platform as well. So I'll go ahead and just click through a couple data sets. I mean, I think for supply chains and those of our clients that have things like mines, other infrastructure like factories, it's very important to monitor some of these risks, because you can't move your port, you can't really move your mine. You can move a factory. It's oftentimes costly and time consuming. But as we monitor kind of the kinetic position of these things around the world, we can start to help our clients just make more informed decisions. So really quick, I'll just show the global port infrastructure and also oil pipelines globally as well. So we can get very granular here and start to look at particular that might this infrastructure. And so as I click around some different data sets here on the left, I click terrorism, understand historically or in real time, I should say, where some terrorism has happened in those areas, subnational insurgencies, crime, these kinds of things that can go ahead and affect your business continuity. So zooming out, we can also look at some climate factors as well, kind of pan across the world here. We track a lot of things in Latin America. So if we click on something like the fires that occurred over the summer, these data sets that we're collecting can kind of give a more realistic picture than perhaps media reports can provide. We should note that we don't ignore the social aspect or the kind of open source news sources as well. On the right side here, we have the ability to ingest news terms, and we're also tracking Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, and again, these open source news sources and blogs. So again, it's a combined panorama of kind of the holistic qualitative picture from an open source researcher and consulting, but also backing it up with some of these big data sets, like a data scientist might internally. So what does all of that mean? Okay, so if you have an asset in one of these countries that's facing a climate, perhaps a social and governance risk, we place the client's assets on the map so they can track these factors in real time and start to just understand their risk aperture a little bit better than, again, just reading the news would do. So, as far as the risks we're trying to protect in that case, certainly reputational risks. So we've seen with different types of companies around the world, whether it's an environmental disaster, reducing a stock price in somewhere in Latin America, or something like a supply chain risk where you're having some abuses come out that have happened. These things can really hurt these days in terms of what's happening for a company's reputation. So I know we're supposed to kind of start Q&A soon. I know I ripped through that and showed a lot of different data and talked about a lot of different factors, but just wanted to pick up on a couple just specific things from that great panorama that Meredith laid out, and I'll go ahead and pass it off to the next presenter.
Fantastic, Trevor. Thank you very much for that information. The next speaker is going to be Todd Binkowski. He's the Business Development Manager for International SOS. International SOS does some really interesting things, very complementary to the work that both Trevor and Meredith do. And so, Todd, are you there?
I'm here.
Fantastic. Where are you calling from today, and what will you be talking about?
I'm calling from a very rainy and cold Washington, D.C., so very different than the sunny and warm that it looks for you right now.
Okay. Apologize for that. So this is actually right close. I'm very close to where the baseball meetings are. So those of you who are baseball fans, the general managers are getting together here in Scottsdale, Arizona. So thank you for sharing more about what you guys do and how companies can take control of the risk relative to travel and other things that you look at.
Absolutely, great. And apologies for not having my video up and going, but a little bit about International SOS. We are what's known as a medical and security assistance company. The easy way to think about that is, as Meredith and Trevor described, a lot of the resources that they have in place from the organizational perspective. A lot of our focus is on the travelers and expatriates that you may actually have on the ground around the world living and traveling on a daily basis. International SOS itself is an organization. We've been around for a little over 30 years now. We have 11,000 clients around the world, 2/3 of which are from the Fortune Global 500. But we work with organizations of all sizes, from those that may be a small NGO that has 5 travelers all the way through to those major multinational organizations. And we support them by a network of over 11,000 medical and security professionals around the world that are stationed in our 26 assistance centers, which are available 24 hours a day for people to call in and get support. And we also have a presence in over 1,000 locations around the world, from the major urban centers to some of the most remote and challenging environments in the world. And as I said, what we generally tend to look at is what is going to affect the travel, your daily operations on the ground. So as Meredith spoke about something like Hong Kong and those business implications, our reporting and intelligence is really geared towards, well, what does it mean to your people on the ground at the moment? Where are the protests happening? How is that in relation to your physical business? And then one of the other things that we do, which is actually a lot more common in terms of the everyday risk, are the health and medical concerns that are happening around the world. We often find that while a lot of the high-level organizational planning and the business resiliency needs to rely on that security and political analysis, when people are actually traveling around the world, oftentimes it is those medical issues that come up. It could be something as simple as someone has landed in India and they forgot their blood pressure medication. Well, if they don't know a reliable place to go get real medication that's not counterfeit, they can miss their meeting, they can have a serious medical incident, and that can have an effect on your business. And so those are some of the issues that we really get into. And when we look at the world a bit differently from that medical perspective, Meredith and Trevor certainly spoke of some of the main concerns from the security perspective, but from that medical perspective, there always seem to be a lot of, we'll say, news-catching events that are going on, but then also on a local level, a lot of issues that organizations don't often think about. When we think of those global medical issues that are always in the news, we think of, it could be your business who is going into the Democratic Republic of Congo for the first time, and you may have serious Ebola concerns. We know that there are outbreaks always happening there, but that's something that your business needs to be aware of from the get-go. Likewise, we see those same types of concerns around things like Zika throughout South America, Central America, and in the Caribbean. And then it always seems that every few years there is some sort of flu popping up, whether we go back 15 years to when we saw things like swine flu and bird flu popping up in China, to whether it is MERS, CoV in the Middle East. Having a real high organizational perspective of those flus that can lead to pandemics also boils down to the traveler and how you're going to manage your business. We help organizations to get an idea of where these types of endemic diseases are so that they can plan them into their long-term business resiliency. As I said, one of the things that we do at International SOS is we're looking at the health and security risks, and we are pushing out alerts for those. It's our standpoint that not only does the organization need to be aware of what these types of risks are, but so do the travelers. So what we make sure that we try and do best is that to educate an organization's travelers and expatriates before they even leave the country. We think it's really important that people have an understanding of what the risks are of their location so that they can take the personal responsibility to keep themselves safe and secure. I know a lot in the market, there's a lot of people are familiar with duty of care. We've also been speaking a lot about the concept of duty of loyalty, where your organization is most likely either doing your part to fulfill your duty of care obligations by looking at the risks and making sure that you're providing services to your people. Every employee also has a responsibility to adhere to those advisories you're giving them, to take responsibility for themselves where you're traveling. And one thing we work with our clients a lot is to empower them by giving those travelers access to real-time information that's impactful for them to actually use while they're on the ground. It's great if a traveler knows that there are protests going on in a city or there is this medical concern in a location they're going to, but your employees also have to know how to action on it. I can tell you right now that at International SOS, we have over 300 active medical and travel security alerts that are going on. And that is everything from simple things like we're seeing in the US where they need to know about travel related issues due to the weather, or if there is a recent cholera outbreak going on in Nigeria. So we really want to make sure that individuals, the travelers themselves, are aware of these issues and that they're doing their part to take care of themselves to fit in with the overall business plans that you have in place. I think I'll stop right there if anyone had any questions or we want to move on.
Okay, Todd, thank you very much. I do have one question relative to what you just said, making the information actionable. I remember when I started traveling internationally 32 years ago, the first visit was Korea, and I remember seeing on the news that there were all sorts of demonstrations apparently going on in Seoul, when it turned out there was really just one small little area that I didn't see till several years later. So sometimes, in fact, many times when you see things on television, it's not an accurate description of the actual situation for your business folks on the ground. How do you take, where do you get the information? How do you make that then actionable so people know what to avoid and have them appreciate the fact that they might be safe when something might be happening quite a bit far away from them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. And that's one of the reasons why at International SOS we have our global capabilities, and we have people all over the world throughout those 26 assistance centers, so that not only are we monitoring some of the news and local contacts we have, but so that we can provide that on the ground information and analysis. And to that point, I've seen that. I've been with International SOS myself over 16 years and have been involved in a lot of our operations, most mainly things going on during the Arab Spring. And I remember during that, believe it was the second uprising in Cairo, where some of the major global news networks were seeing tanks rolling down the street. But our guys were in the middle of Tahrir Square looking around and saying, no, there are no tanks here, because some of the news networks were using footage from the prior crisis. We saw a similar situation in Thailand a few years ago when there were mass protests going on, and you would look at the news and you would think that all of Bangkok was under military control, where by having our presence on the ground, we were able to look and see, well, no, it's just pretty centralized to the main square, the main street. There were even people barbecuing, enjoying the day on the sides of the protests. So that's really what we try and do, is use those global resources that we are always engaging with on a 24/7 basis to make sure that when we deliver information to people, we don't want to be a news service. We want to give them, we want to inform them about what's going on the ground, but then most crucially, give them advice. It's great if managers back at the office have an idea of what's going on, but we need to give them advice for how to manage their people on the ground. And likewise, if someone is in country or in a location, they need to know certainly what's going on, but then what should they do? Is it an environment where they should go to an airport or begin to remove themselves? Or do they stand fast in their hotel or just hunker down for the day, things like that. So it's really about what we say, getting through the hype and getting to the real information that people need to know.
Great. Well, speaking about the real information and a real international business person, our last speaker is Armando Yuri Rangel. And Armando, every time I talk to him, he's somewhere else. He's today in Aguas Caliente, where they maintain, his company, Cypher Learning, maintains an office. But I believe the last time we spoke, he was in the Philippines, and he had been all over Asia. And so what we wanted to have was someone who is a worldwide traveler who deals with these types of issues all the time. And very curious, Armando, what systems you use to be able to be safe out there. So thank you for sharing your ideas today.
Thank you, Doc, and thank you, Trevor, Meredith, Todd. This is very helpful on what I'm doing right now. And I really want to share the experience from someone that is traveling worldwide. I'm gonna share my screen very fast just to show you a little bit about our company. And I'm not sure if you can see my screen. This is our company presence worldwide. And we're opening offices almost every month in different regions in the world. And one of the challenges specifically is, even for the first step in any of those countries, we need to think about so many things. And the questions are always related to a cultural analysis. You know about that. It's something crucial. If we're going to do business in certain regions, we need to understand their cultural behaviors and what's going on from the cultural side, the economical side. And of course, we have talked about the social risk and the healthy risk and the basic business etiquette even in those countries, which is part of of preparing the scenario to be safe on this the startup of doing businesses in different regions worldwide. Sometimes, and at the beginning, and let me tell you about my personal experience, at the beginning I just start traveling around, opening different offices, looking for the people, until once I realized that when I was traveling to Brazil, but I had a layover in Panama. I wanted to go outside of Panama and walk around and just do some touristic things. The CBP guide told me if I had this yellow certificate for malaria and yellow fever, and I didn't have that at that moment. And he told me, you're not going to be able to enter to Brazil if you don't have that certificate. From that moment, I realized that what Todd is talking about, it's a real thing that needs to be addressed if you want to expand. And it sounds very simple, but you never know what's going on in different countries. From there, we opened different policies to start talking about all these topics. The security and social environment in the world, in different countries. We were about to open an office in Hong Kong. After analyzing the different situations they're facing, we decided to hold that office a little bit because the social and political situation wasn't that good to start working in that country. Chile situation these days is not that great because we are in a technology for education company solution. So teachers are fighting there. So it's not the best scenario right now. So it's always important before even start a business or doing businesses in one country to understand all these factors of risks. And even before traveling people there. If we have to travel people there, then we move forward on understanding from this, the cultural analysis, vaccinations, insurances. We have different insurances right now with Bupa. Bupa has a very powerful international insurance. And security. Security is also really important from where the hotel we're choosing in different regions. Even important brands, sometimes they're not very well located in safe areas and regions in different countries. So we need to do this kind of a research that, for example, International SOS are helping to perform, and documents, and medication. Medication, it's an important factor because that's real. We cannot find all the medicines with the same name or even very specifics. And if we don't have the receipt from the doctors, you cannot get that medicine in different countries. Everything of that has to be addressed through different organizations. In our case, Bupa Insurances is working for us, but also I think the solution that International SOS is giving, it's quite interesting. So Todd, we have to talk later about this. Different countries, different challenges. In our experience, it's also important to talk about and understand the disease, not only in the region, but in the connecting flights. That's also important because sometimes we're targeting, for example, Congo. There's some risk, but we have different flight connections related with Congo, probably. And we even have to think at that level on understanding because the atmosphere and the environment in these connections, layovers in different countries is always also something that we need to consider. So the puzzle is quite complex, but it's better to plan ahead in front of different trips with the right advice than just trying to move by yourself, understanding it's complex, and the scenario of the world is we have to contemplate different situations like the safety, security, because foreigners in all the countries are always a target for these situations. For example, I had 1 week before I traveled once to the Philippines, they had a bomb in one of the international hotels. It was the Shangri-La at that moment. So I had a reservation at that hotel. If I'd have arrived 1 week before we planned, maybe I was one of those targets there. So, but it didn't happen. But the analysis of taking the right rules and security and advice from these experts will also help to avoid any kind of those situations. So I appreciate this time to have these advisors and counselors. So I don't want to take more time because the experience is so general in this case. But from my experience is we cannot just start traveling worldwide. There's so many things that we need to address with these experts to have a safe and secure flight and travel and trip in different countries, but also to do businesses in a safer way. We really need to address different situations and analysis, from cultural analysis, economical analysis, social analysis, and health analysis. And that's basically what I want to share.
Okay, thank you very much, Armando. We do have some questions coming in, and so one of them may be more of a comment, but embedded in there, I think there's at least a question. This is you, Ken Slayton of GBG. If you have a specific question, let us know. What I saw there was a question relative to the Republic of China. So really kind of the relationship between Taiwan and China is, there's a level of risk there. So how can companies consider working both in China and with Taiwan, given the tension that's there, and how would that information be dialed into a strategy? That's probably a really big question, but any thoughts?
All right, did you have someone in particular you wanted to answer that?
Oh, I was thinking either Meredith or Trevor would be able to do that, and so, but anybody.
Sure. So we have a lot of clients that work in both Taiwan and China, and it is a very difficult balance. What we are seeing, and this has been consistent over the last about 4 or 5 years, but particularly in the last 3 or so, is a push to ensure that if these companies are working in both Taiwan and China, that they are recognizing China as through the OneChina Policy, basically, right? That Taiwan is part of China. So the pushback that they get is if their website, happens to mention Taiwan in any way that looks like it is not part of China, they will sanction, they will fine you. They push all of the airlines basically to change their websites in the last year. But it's hyper political, and if they can walk the line of not upsetting either side, they're more or less okay. The biggest problem that I think a lot of them run into is it's the U.S. government line on Taiwan versus the China line on Taiwan. But at the end of the day, what tends to happen in any of these areas around China is China ultimately, will hand that company an ultimatum that says, you either do business the way we want you to do, or you lose access to the Chinese market. And, just from purely a financial perspective, most of them will choose to, retain access to the Chinese market. So it is a very fine line, and anybody who is, who's working in those countries knows having local knowledge, local managers who understand how to navigate that is absolutely crucial. Does that make sense?
It does. It's tricky, but so that sounds like it's more of a business approach.
It's absolutely a business approach. I mean, there has to be, I think there was a time where maybe the approach could be a little more haphazard, but it absolutely has to be a well thought out and fully understood decision going to work in both and either of these places. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that China is reliant to a certain degree on the business that goes on in Taiwan, because they also have Foxconn, for example, is a Taiwanese-owned business that is all over China, right? They've got factories everywhere in China. That's where they make iPhones. That's where they make Samsung. All of this technology that is made in China. So there is some dependency there with China and Taiwan as well. But from a political perspective, a lot of it is about, is more about how it looks from the outside. And so that understanding of where the lines are is really important. We had a client just not too long ago. One of their people did not fully understand the issue with sending certain types of material to China, and sent something over a big group email that included a bunch of things related to the protests and all of this. And the manager in Hong Kong came back very upset and said, you can't do this. You have to, you really have to understand the liability that creates when you don't understand what you're sending to China. So it really does come down to a lot of good communication and planning, and just understanding where the lines are.
That sounds good. Another question from Maimun, and if you find that you haven't answered a question and you'd like to add something, please go ahead and do that. From Maimun, he's talking more around cultural biases. So this may not be so much of a risk factor, but his question is, how does an entrepreneur who's dealing in multiple countries overcome a cultural bias, like for instance, their own cultural bias toward the group that they may be visiting, or vice versa?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I think, just maintaining a sense of patience, first of all. So, in terms of a temporal aspect or a time aspect, cultures move at different paces. And so, what may feel like a client dragging their feet or a snub because they're taking a little while, that may just be all in due course. And so that's I think in the last 3 or 4 years of doing business internationally, the best advice I could give. I know that's very general, but if you kind of expand your sense of expectation along timelines, then I think you're going to find more success.
May I add something else? It's about empathy also. Empathy with the customer is really, really important as an entrepreneur in worldwide approach. We really need to understand the approach of the business based on the specific cultural beliefs and cultural and business etiquette. And I mentioned that in a very broad way, but it's really important. It's not the same way. Very simple thing as how you share your business card. And that's probably and making nonsense for a lot of people, but that's open also different doors in different countries. So being empathic with the approach, different cultural approaches, it's also really important, and understand the beliefs and the cultural and even religious beliefs. It's really important to address these challenges in different countries and regions.
Thank you, Armando. There's another question for you, and also there's a component that Todd mentions he'd like to address, the insurance portion. So for you, Senor Armando, how do you tackle a bad bilateral trade relations, which is potentially risky in your favor?
That's an interesting question, and we have the same question already in different scenarios. For example, a couple of months ago, China blocks the negotiations with all the cloud services based in the US. So they closed the network totally for all the services like our services. However, internally, they decided, different schools decided, and organizations decided to move forward through a VPN service to address that situation. but that wasn't the solution, a real solution. So what we are trying to achieve right now, and we understand that after different negotiations, is we have another subsidiary in Australia, and the relationship between China and Australia is different. So the market has to be addressed through the China, through the Australian subsidiary as a first step. The second step is how the Chinese understand businesses. It's a so Chinese way. So we really need to find a good partner inside China to address that commercial issue. If they understand that we understand, and it's also about empathy in the business side to be more related on what their specific requires. So that helps us to address the government's trade challenges. If we are also involved from different perspectives, we can offer the American way or style, but we can also offer the Australian relationship, and there's different trade agreements. But at the end, in the case of China, we really have to have a subsidiary inside China. There's no other way to address that situation. There's other cases, like let me try. We have, for example, now travel to Qatar. We have a negotiation with the Ministry of Education, and their condition to start doing business with them, it's not exactly a trade agreement, but it's about the language. So language is important for them, and it's really critical. So Arabic is mandatory even above the negotiation of the contract. So commercial things most of these times are becoming regulated for those trade agreements, but also we need to understand the cultural aspect. That will be more powerful than the trade agreement to find alternatives together with your customers. You're on mute, Doc.
I guess it helps to hit the unmute. Sorry about that. Todd, would you like to handle the insurance part of that question?
Yeah, I was just going to touch briefly on that. And just so everyone's aware, at International SOS, what we do a lot on the medical and security side, whether that is evacuations or finding the right facility to send people, all those services get paid for by insurance. So we have a strong relationship with insurance providers all over the world. And what we often find is the question that came in was about, I believe it's talking about foreign nationals enrolling in their foreign insurance, and that being treated in a place like Taiwan versus China. And this is where we see the role of an assistance company such as ours to be very impactful, whether it's International SOS or another assistance provider that you are using. What it does is it allows you to make sure that your people are getting the care that they need. And then while the people is getting the appropriate care, then the insurance portion is taken care of, because in some places there are limitations to if a local environment will accept an insurance, whether that is a foreign versus local. So what's really important is that you have that operational piece in place, like an International SOS, who can provide those services that will then work with your insurer, whomever it is on the back end, to make sure that those costs and financial risks are taken care of. Because particularly the China-Taiwan scenario is interesting, because you can imagine if you did have some sort of medical emergency in Taiwan, and why Taiwan has world-class healthcare, if there was a need to get someone out of Taiwan, you couldn't necessarily easily take them to mainland China. So you need to make sure that you have a provider who is aware of that and has the resources to be able to move people to appropriate places in different parts of the world.
Such a critical point. Myself, having had medical emergencies in Japan and Singapore, those are very well developed countries with good healthcare programs, and both times the medical system let us down tremendously. And so the point that Todd brings up is very important, considering most of you, many of you are travelers, you're going around the world, and you've got to take care of your health and be ready for any kind of emergency. I unfortunately need to say, hey, we're at the end of our hour. So that went by really quick. There's a lot to talk about around the world. So really appreciate all of our speakers today, our experts, Meredith, Trevor, Todd, and Armando, for all of your input. For the questions that we didn't get covered today, we'll follow up with a blog post in about a week or 10 days, and then have this available by video as well. Does anybody have any last comments before we sign off?
Just want to thank the rest of the speakers. That was fantastic information.
Great, thank you, Todd. And thank you, all of you, for what you've shared today. Our next presentations coming up, we've got a League of Extraordinaries, actually two of them, one in English, one in Spanish next week. We also have an event on trade pacts, trade deals, and trade status in Latin America coming up as well. I believe that is could be later this week or it could be next week, but very soon. So we have one or two programs like this a week. The goal is to make sure that our members have at their fingertips all of the experts they need to be successful, and we certainly heard from 4 excellent ones today. Thank you again, everybody, for your time, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.